Today we're going to be talking about foundational mental skills for rock climbing. And so if we remember the principles of training, those apply to mental skills training the same way that they apply to physical skills training or technical skills training. And if you remember that developmental wheel, we have physical, technical, and mental. And within the mental skills training component, we've got emotions, feelings and sensations, and our behaviors. And this is representative of both in the performance environment and in your training. And so today we're going to be talking about those fundamental mental skills that are going to be really helpful for rounding out an athlete's performance enhancement. It's important to consider the fact that mental skills training follows the same principles that physical skills training do. And so when we're talking about this, we want to be thinking in terms of specificity to yourself and the idea of consistency and frequency and overload of these skills, some variation between them, and then considering the last piece being simplicity. And so making sure that we're not adding too much complexity to your training regimen and your performance life as it is. So when we look at foundational mental skills, we're talking about 4 main pieces, and that's going to be drive and motivation, self-awareness, productive thinking, and self-confidence. And we don't want to really move past those too quickly, much the same way that we want to build the foundation of strength before we do any kind of nuanced or peaking. We want to make sure that we're solidifying our foundation in our mental skills before we get into any kind of like mindfulness meditation or imagery pieces, which do enhance performance, and we will talk about that in the future. But we want to make sure that we're taking care of the key elements before we move to the fancy stuff afterwards. So when we talk about motivation, we're talking about what keeps the athlete moving forward in the sport that they're engaging in. We're talking about rock climbing, of course. And when we look at that, we can see pretty clearly an individual who is persisting through challenge, chooses specific challenges within climbing, projects that are appropriately challenging for them, push them beyond their comfort zone, and they persist through setbacks. They change the way in which they relate to the sport depending on injury and things like that. Those are athletes that we would deem that have a high level of motivation. And the contrary is true as well, in considering that if an athlete or yourself, you're looking at yourself and you're saying like, okay, I normally pick things that are well within my comfort zone. I spend a lot of time in the gym working on skills and technical facets that I really already have wired, but they make me feel really good when I work on them. And when I do come across adverse situations, failure, any kind of setback, injury, I tend to second guess myself, and I think about what it would be like to not be a climber altogether. Those are individuals who tend to have low motivation. And what's important here is that we can cultivate motivation and drive. It's a skill. It's something that we can work on. A key critique of a lot of people is that they think that motivation is an innate thing. It's a given talent. You either have it or you don't. But this is not true. We can help people cultivate motivation, and you can cultivate motivation within yourself. And before even working on that, a secondary component to motivation is understanding that there are 2 fundamental dimensions of motivation. And so we want to be considering the quality of your motivation and the quantity of your motivation. And so what I mean by that is, let's consider that it's in season, you're projecting, you're excited, your motivation is really high to get a particular route or project done, that would be like you're considering the quantity of your motivation. You have a lot of drive going into the season to try to get the thing done that you're trying to get done. But you succeed or you don't, and then the season goes away and your motivation drops. And so then we would start to look at the quality of somebody's motivation, and that's really looking at the persistent factor over a long period of time of an individual's motivation to remain stable. And that's a really important piece, because the more stable we are in our motivational factors over a long period of time correlate to a longer period of success over the life of somebody's climbing career. After the fact of considering the quality and the quantity of your motivation, we want to touch on the fact that there are two other aspects that we need to look at. Intrinsic motivation, so drive that comes from within you, self-driving factors, or external motivation or extrinsic motivation, factors that are outside of you. And that would be like your community, the environment that you spend time in, the people that you climb with. When considering intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, internal motivation, or motivation that is depicted by gold medals and things like that, what I really want to underscore is that lots of people consider it to be I either am intrinsically motivated or I am extrinsically motivated, and I need to get intrinsically motivated, one or the other. But really it's an and scenario where being both intrinsically motivated and extrinsically motivated is important and facilitates high performance. So what we want to understand is that while being intrinsically motivated or motivated by your personal drive to get better at something is a stronger form of motivation, we see across the board that external motivators, beating a competitor, winning a gold medal, putting up first ascents, those kinds of motivations that come from outside of who you are, facilitate just as much high performance as intrinsic motivation does. And really, when we talk about self-awareness, we want to make sure that we put honesty in front of that. And the reason being is because the only way that we're going to be able to develop along a continuum of getting better at rock climbing or reproducing results that we've had in the past or making adjustments to training sessions is if we're honest about what happened. And so we can be self-aware, but if it's not in the light of honesty, then we're not really doing ourselves a favor. We're actually wasting time. So again, second piece here is to create and cultivate honest self-awareness. What we're trying to do is help athletes build an awareness around the things that they do, whether that's at the cliff, in whatever performance environment that you engage with, the training environment that you spend time in, and your everyday life. And the reason that we want to be able to cultivate an ability to be self-aware is so that we can either change our habits for the better, so enhance our performance in the future, or we can replicate high performance environments that produced success. And so how do we do that? How do we help or create self-awareness? Well, the easiest place to start is logging what you do. And we do this, and we ask people to do this in their physical training. So thinking about sets and reps and time under tension, you think about writing down the amount of seconds that you hang on a hangboard. And that's really great because you're able to look back at what you did and either increase the intensity or decrease it or keep it the same. And that allows for you to progress in your training. Well, the same goes for your mental, emotional, and behavioral well-being to help you change your habits or reproduce habits that produce high performance. And so the first thing that we need to do is pay attention to how we act at the cliff, how we act in our training environment, the things that we say to ourselves, the behaviors that we do based on those things that we say to ourselves. We have 2 basic exercises that you can go through to help coax along the process of developing self-awareness. And the first exercise is to think back to a time when you performed at your best. It was a perfect day, you executed the route of the boulder problem exactly as you thought you would. And what I want you to think about and write down and record is all of the thoughts that you had, the things that you said to yourself, the people that you were with, the type of day, the time of day that it was, the weather that was going on. You want to basically build a movie out of that day and write it down so that you know that these are the type of facets, the things that you say to yourself, the thoughts that you have, the behaviors that you engaged with that led you to a high performance state, sending your project. And again, let's remember that we're trying to replicate those things that led us to high performance and then change the things that don't. And so the other part of this exercise is reflecting and thinking back on a day where you had a terrible performance. You performed at your worst. And consider and think about and write down the things that you were thinking, the things that you were saying to yourself, the people that you were with, the time of day that it was. Build the movie of the day, write it down, reflect on it, and then work to change those facets that can be changed. And we will talk about self-talk and we will talk about visualization and partnerships in the future. But for right now, we want to just understand the components that go into self-awareness. And part of that, what you're seeing here, is logging those performance days that were at your best and at your worst. Start building a repertoire of those facets that produce in both directions. The second exercise for building self-awareness is going to be thinking and reflecting on a broader scale. So before we talked about one day, one instance, bad performance, good performance, what I want you to begin to think about is an entire week of training and climbing. Think back to how the week was laid out. What were your thoughts during the week? What did you say to yourself during practice and training? What time of the day did you go and train? Did that facilitate a good experience or a bad experience? Were you with people while you were training? Were you listening to music while you were training or not? Did you get good sleep? Was your nutrition good? There's an endless amount of information that you can put into a log. But if I may sound like a broken record, we're trying to build a deep, honest self-awareness of what you do day in and day out to help produce long-term results or make changes to do that. And so when you think about a long-term vision or a week of your training, were you being as productive as you could have been? Were you being as genuine or kind to yourself as you could have been? Were you scheduling your week as best you can? These are all things that go into a self-awareness practice.